Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om Tat Sat. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Professor Paul Lodge. He is a professor of philosophy at Oxford University and a fellow of Mansfield College. He's one of the world's leading experts in the philosophy of G.W. Leibniz. He's the editor of 3 volumes on Leibniz. The titles are Locke and Leibniz on Substance, published by Routledge in 2015. The Leibniz-De Volder Correspondence, published by Yale University Press, 2013. And Leibniz and His Correspondence, published by Cambridge University Press, 2004. He's currently editing a collection of introductory essays on Leibniz's key texts, which will be published by Oxford University Press, probably within the next year. So today's session, the format will be, it's going to be an interactive question and answer session on the topic of Leibniz's views on the relationship between science and religion. And the format will be, I'm going to invite Professor Paul Lodge very soon to come up and just speak for a few minutes introducing the topic, and then we'll just open it up for dialogue and discussion, and you can ask whatever questions you have on your mind. Please make sure that the questions you ask are relevant to the topic, so please don't go too far off topic. Okay, that's my only request. Okay, so please join me in welcoming Professor Paul Lodge.
Yep, got it. Okay, thank you. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming to listen. I hope I'll be able to leave you at least a little bit better informed than when you arrived. So my aim today is maybe to talk for about 20 minutes, and I will talk about Leibniz and the relationship between science and religion, as you've heard. I'll approach that by talking about 4 different things and then bringing it together. So I want to tell you a little bit about Leibniz himself to begin with, in case some of you really don't know anything about him. Though some of that will be relevant, something about his life and what he did more generally. Then I'll talk about his views, in a very broad sense, his views about religion itself. Then I want to talk about the metaphysical views that he has, which are relevant to the way in which he thinks about religion, and which play a kind of mediating role between the way he thinks about religion and science, by which I'm going to mean primarily physics, sort of what evolves into what we call physics now, the science of the fundamental aspects of reality. And then, having sketched the relationship between the physics and the metaphysics, then I'll come back to say some things about how physics might then be relevant for his views about religion. So hopefully it'll come around in a circle and make some kind of sense in that way. So if I start with Leibniz himself, he was born in 1646 and died in 1716. So quite a long life, and this means that he was born just after what's referred to as the 30 Years' War in Europe, which was a war which, it was a series of conflicts which were, broadly speaking, brought about because of the rise of the Protestant religions in Europe and the conflicts between Catholics and Protestants, different kinds of Protestants, as they were fighting to control bits of territory. And it was horrible. I don't know how many people died, but many, many people died. It was chaotic. And so something that Leibniz brought to his thinking was the need to rebuild in the wake of this chaos and this death and carnage that had taken place in Europe. And that's very important for his way of thinking about things, I think. he spent most of his life working for the House of Hanover, so the people who were the noblemen in the city of Hanover, which is in Lower Saxony in Germany, and the last person that he worked for was the Elector of Hanover, who subsequently became George I of England, so the first of the 18th century Hanoverian dynasty in England. So it's that royal family that he worked for, who then became very significant in the history of England and Britain. And he worked mainly as a librarian, technically, but he spent his time doing all kinds of things. He was asked to write a history of the family, and he prolonged that for well over 20 years, just so that he could use it as an excuse to be paid, really, whilst he did all the things he wanted to do. What's he most famous for? Well, I think he's most famous probably, I mean, people think of him as, in some sense, being a philosopher, but the most famous thing that he did was that he discovered the calculus. And in fact, the notation that we use for the calculus today is derived from Leibniz. Famously, Newton discovered it around the same time, independently, and there was a big argument between the supporters of Newton and Leibniz's supporters as to who did it first, and they said that Leibniz had stolen it from Newton. All of this seems to have been false, and in a way Leibniz wins because the sigma notation for the integral calculus and other aspects of the notation are Leibniz's rather than Newton's. He did other things in maths. He sort of invented binary arithmetic, and some of his work on a thing which he called analysis situ, which was an alternative to analytic geometry, it was in some ways fed into the beginnings of topology. There are other things as well. I mean, I don't know enough about mathematics to know about various other things that he did, but he's a very significant figure, although lots of his ideas were never published, and people are finding them now and still being somewhat, surprised by how much he'd already seen of what mathematics did later on. He also was what we would call a physicist. A natural philosopher, as he would have been called at the time. Perhaps the most famous thing that we can see in his physics is that he is someone who develops something which is very close to the notion of kinetic energy. And the laws of motion that he has for the material world include the conservation of the size times the square of the speed of a body. So it's very similar to half mv squared, which is the formula for kinetic energy. And so it's not, the laws are not exactly the same, but it's a similar kind of idea which was developed by other people. Again, other things in physics, but I'll just point to that one. He had lots of ideas for technology. Many of them didn't come to very much, but most famously he invented one of the very first calculating machines, which he showed to the Royal Society in the 1670s, and so this was, again, well ahead of its time. The philosophy itself, which I'll talk about to some extent today, is both fascinating, and obviously Leibniz is known as one of the great philosophers in the Western tradition, and in many ways, in particular, Immanuel Kant's philosophy evolves out of Leibniz's philosophy and Leibniz's followers' philosophy, and then it has a huge influence on the subsequent tradition in the West. Without Kant, there really isn't a 19th century philosophy or a reaction to it in the 20th century philosophy in the way that it happened. And Leibniz is in the background. Without Leibniz, there is no Kant, really. Less well known than people should know. I mean, he's not recognized as much as being Kant's precursor, but he really was. He also did foundational work in geology, had a theory about the origins of the Earth, in linguistics, and then he was involved in very practical things like social planning. He worked for the court, and he had all kinds of ideas about health insurance, pensions, and even a plan for street lighting, which was subsequently used in Vienna, though not in Hanover, where he lived. So he was, really involved in coming up. He had ideas coming everywhere about anything you could think of. And then he was, as a courtier, involved in diplomatic missions as well, especially earlier in his life. And one of the key diplomatic themes for him connects back to the 30 Years' War, because at various points Leibniz was keenly involved in attempts to initially reunite the Catholic Church with the Protestant churches, and then subsequently, having failed to do that, to try to reunite the Calvinist and the Lutheran traditions within the Protestant church. So this goal of trying to bring everybody together in the wake of the chaos of the 30 Years' War was very, very much a part of how he thought about things. And that starts to feed into my next section, which is about religion. And so although this could have just been something that somebody thought because they saw the political landscape around them, it wasn't just that. It was coming out of his deep views about the nature of reality. So let me try to sketch some of those deepest views, which are essentially his theological views. And the relationship between those theological views and what we might think of as religion in practice, institutionalized religion. So Leibniz favors what we sometimes refer to as natural religion. So he doesn't think that religion should be primarily derived through Scripture, considered it as revealed truth. He thinks that all human beings have within them the capacity to know the things that they need to know about God and God's relationship to the world in order to achieve salvation, essentially. And that's very minimal. He thinks that you need to recognize that God exists and that God is that God is an all-loving being. And in order to recognize that God is all-loving, you have to accept that God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and also all-good. So the traditional Christian or Western conception of the divine nature Leibniz accepts, but he sees this really as coming together as an expression of a more fundamental notion of perfect love. So God is a perfectly loving ground for all of reality. And as I say, he thinks that all human beings have innate ideas that enable them, if they are exposed to the right kinds of experiences, to come to discover this for themselves. They don't need to be told this by other people, although they will need to talk to other people to come to reflect on the relevant ideas. Okay. For all that he has this belief about natural religion, Leibniz thinks that, politically speaking, and more generally socially speaking, Christianity in Western Europe has been a fairly good custodian of this idea of what God is. And in particular, Christianity introduces the idea of immortality. And this is the main thing that Jesus, according to Leibniz, did, is he taught the doctrine of immortality. But Leibniz also thinks that that's something that you can come to know to be true just by reflecting on your own innate ideas. So it's something that if we think hard enough, we will see has to be the case. But Jesus said it to people so that they could then come to realize that it was the case for themselves. And the role of institutional religion then, which Leibniz thinks historically it's performed fairly well, is to ensure that people are able to come to have this knowledge of God and knowledge of immortality. And insofar as they come to have this knowledge, Leibniz thinks that, they really come to internalize this knowledge, then they will also come to be loving beings themselves, and that you will get this community of people who are kind of expressing the divine nature to the fullest extent that they can, and they're all expressing it and kind of expressing it toward each other, so you get this harmonious community of loving, creative beings. And as I say, he thinks that institutionalized religion is working well insofar as the members of that religion are coming to have that kind of personality and coming to behave in that kind of way. And as such, because he thinks that Christianity is quite close to doing that, a lot of the things that he writes are just defenses of certain aspects of the Christian religion, though he thinks that some of those are kind of they are ways of expressing these views which are readily intelligible to people who are not as educated as the most enlightened people, and so he's prepared to defend certain kinds of doctrines which are in addition to the basic doctrines that I've just given, where it's clear, I think, that he thinks that really the only doctrines that you need if you are sufficiently enlightened, sufficiently educated, are these very basic ones. So he will defend the Eucharist, so the mystery of the Eucharist, the idea that Jesus is present on the altar during the Christian Mass. He will defend the idea that Jesus is the unique incarnation of God, but it's very unclear that he actually thinks that himself. That seems to be a kind of a political thing. He seems to think that in 17th century Europe, Christianity is the best available, though there are always these hints that maybe in the future something else might evolve, and that maybe this idea that Jesus is the unique incarnation of God will not be a necessary part of future religion. Okay, so I've talked about Leibniz, I've talked about his views on religion. Now I want to say a little bit about what he thinks God creates. And this is where it starts to get more difficult to understand. God creates through a process of self-replication, essentially. So I've told you that Leibniz thinks God has a certain set of features, and what happens is that God produces an infinite number of beings, all of which have the same features as God, but in a more limited way. And the way that you get an infinite number is that each degree to which the divine nature can be lessened constitutes one of the things that's brought into existence. So you have an infinite hierarchy. You have God at the top, and then an infinite number of beings, all of which have the same nature as God, but are less perfect. And that goes on forever, downward from God. So they're all the same. They are referred to as monads later in his life. He doesn't always call them monads, but that's the word that people use. That's one of the words that's most associated with Leibniz's philosophy. So everything that exists, and the only things that exist, are these monads and God. What are they like? Well, Leibniz says a little bit more about them, or tries to flesh this out a little bit. As we can see, God is portrayed essentially as just an infinite mind. And all of the monads, since they are just like God, are perhaps, though it's a little bit more complicated, best thought of as more limited minds, or souls, or spirits, I don't know, whichever language you want to use, but they simply have psychological properties. And in particular, they are immaterial, or to put it another way, they don't have any size, they don't take up any space. There isn't really any such thing as space for Leibniz. Space is a feature of our confused awareness of this infinite plurality of things. It's a way that somehow we're able to represent the fact that they exist. But space only exists in the minds of the things which are perceiving this infinite number of other minds. So it's a very radical metaphysical view. Descartes' view was around at the time. Some of you may be aware that Descartes famously was committed to a form of dualism. He thought the material world and the human mind were radically different to each other. And in a way, Leibniz can be seen as just throwing away the idea of the material world and saying that everything that exists is a little bit like a Cartesian mind. Though what he would want to say is that some of them are like us, and we really are like the Cartesian minds. Some of them are a lot cleverer than us because we're not that close to God, but some of them are a lot less clever than us. And so you have the idea that the minds can think, they can use concepts. Then animals, they can't use concepts, but they have sensory experiences and they can kind of remember things. So if you hit a dog repeatedly, it will be aware of the fact that it shouldn't bark at the child or something like that, so they can remember. And then you go down to these very low-grade monads, who are supposed to be something like, they have the kind of state of mind which is a bit like the state of mind that we have when we're asleep, where there might be very minimal awareness. but not self-awareness, and not even, it's barely awareness, but still kind of mental. So that's the picture that we've got. There's an infinite number of them. Okay. So what about the material world, and then feeding into natural science and physics? Well, I've already said one thing about the material world, namely, although it seems that there is this spatially extended realm that we are aware of that's distinct from us and distinct from the other minds in the world, that's in some sense an illusion. Moreover, the existence of material things like tables and chairs is in some sense an illusion. It's not a complete illusion, because what Leibniz wants to say is that when you look at a chair, you are confusedly aware of an infinite subset of the infinite number of monads that exist. So in some sense, material things are collections of immaterial things. They appear to be material, but that's an illusion, and that illusion is a function of the fact that we're not clever enough, we're not like God, so we're not able to extract the infinite amount of information that is in the state of awareness that we have when we look at the chair. If we were really, really clever, in some way that we can't conceive of because we're not clever enough, we would know that there was an infinite number of things there, and we would be aware of them as individuals, and we'd be aware exactly what they were like. But we can't do that. However, there is an interesting case, because as we look around the room, some things are not inanimate. Some things are not just like chairs, namely the people. And the people stand out as genuine individuals in a way that chairs don't. You can chop chairs up into as many pieces as you want. They don't have the same kind of robust individuality as a human being. You can't chop a human being up. You can chop arms and legs off a human being, but you're still left with a human being. Why is that? Because in some sense, when you see a human being, you are having a window into the fact that there is a monad there, and the human being really is the monad. So if I look at somebody in the room, I'm not seeing the monad, because we see physical things, but I'm being made aware of the existence of the monad. The monad that controls, or seems to control, the part of the world that I'm looking at. And Leibniz actually thinks that chairs are made up of little animals. So everywhere that you look, even though you can't see them, there are tiny animals. Although, if you look down a microscope, you do see some of them. So Leibniz sometimes uses the image of, if we had microscopic eyes, we would just keep seeing more and more tiny things swirling around. Animate things, living things. And every time we saw one of those, we would be aware of, though not seeing, we would be seeing the animate thing, but we would know that it was controlled by a monad. So in some sense, we would know that the monad was there. So hopefully that makes some sense, but obviously I can try and explain it more later. If that's what's there, just immaterial things, then physics, the physics of Leibniz, which like all the other physics in the 17th century, talks about inanimate things, laws of motion, which are concerned with the speed and the size and the relative position of immaterial things, cannot be telling us about what's really there. What it's doing is it's telling us about the way in which really there appears to us. And it's telling us about regular patterns within the appearances. So if we go back to the chair, there's a collection of monads there, but there's only a collection because I'm collecting them together. And once I've collected them together as a chair, then I can start to say, well, the chair has a certain size, and maybe it has a certain speed, and then in principle I can do physics and predict certain things about what's going to happen to the chair. But I'm not talking about anything that really exists now. I'm talking about something that's a fiction, something that I've made up. And it's a kind of shorthand for what's really there. And all physics, all the mathematical physics that Leibniz invented, is in the end a description of a world that doesn't really exist. So it's not really a description of anything. In fact, I think the best way to think about it is that it is an intellectual tool that we use in order to predict the way that things are going to appear in the future. And no more than that. But there is an interesting aspect to this, because some of the things I was saying before, some of what we see when we look around the world are monads which are appearing as if they were living things. And of course those living things have bodies. So if we wanted to, we could treat the body of a human being as if it was an immaterial thing, assign some kind of geometrical structure to that, and then we could do physics about that geometrical structure. So for example, if we did our physics well enough, we might be able to predict where that body would be in an hour's time. So we'd be able to follow the monad around as well. So there is a kind of a way in which the physics and the metaphysics connects together, but the physics provides us with a tool for tracking the monads. That's one thing it could do. But it also provides us with a tool that enables us to know what our experiences are going to be like, and to do things like create the technology that allows us to modify our experiences. But in all of the cases, natural science has this kind of pragmatic dimension to it. And moreover, the decisions that we make about which bodies to pay attention to, which bodies to treat as if they are at rest, because Leibniz thinks the world is continually changing, so if you assign a velocity to something, then you have to assume that that thing is moving relative to some frame of rest, but nothing is resting. So immediately we've got this kind of another kind of illusion, and broadly speaking, the decisions that we make as a community of thinkers in order to assign, if a physicist is coming up with a model or an engineer is using a model from physics, then the way in which they decide what the bodies are doing, what speeds they're moving at, is always a function of what they're trying to do, what they're trying to achieve. If you were building a bridge, then an engineer would have to treat a certain chunk of concrete as if it weighed a certain amount. But all of these things will be part of this kind of illusory world. I'm missing out lots and lots of detail there, but I want to come back to the relationship now between science and religion, because I've suggested very, very crudely that natural science is designed to enable us to achieve the kinds of things that we want to achieve, to make the kinds of things that enable us to achieve the kinds of things that we want to achieve. So far I've done that in terms, broadly speaking, in terms of being able to predict what the world is going to be like, to not be surprised by the future. But why does that matter? Well, we can now come full circle. Again, in a relatively complicated way that would require much more explanation. What Leibniz is saying or thinking is that when science is working well, what it is doing is it's allowing us to produce the kinds of tools that allow us to sustain the kinds of institutions that promote natural religion, that enable people to become more aware of the truths about God that they need in order to achieve personal salvation. Now, it may not be the case that natural science does a very good job of this, but Leibniz would think that's because people are not well enough informed about the relationship between science and salvation. So a scientist might invent or do the science that's required to create an atom bomb, and you might think, well, that's not really doing what Leibniz thinks science should be doing. And he would agree, but that's partly because human beings are not always very good at understanding the kinds of tools that they need to create in order to make the world better in the way that he thinks it should be. But he does think in the background that, and another commitment here which he has, is that once created, the world will just continue to exist. And in fact, the very same individual beings will continue to exist forever. So the version of immortality that he has is actually much more like a reincarnation doctrine. So that you die, what Leibniz actually says is you die and you get very small, and then you can get big again. And you stay in community with exactly the same infinite plurality of beings. So although it might be going badly at the moment, Leibniz has a story according to which everything is connected, and because it was created by this perfectly good God in the first place, then there is a progression. Things are getting better. And some of these things that appear bad now are a necessary condition for better things that will happen in the future. So everything that we're doing in natural science is, the practice of natural science exists because eventually it will enable human beings to create better and better social institutions, and those social institutions will be good insofar as they enable people to have the proper understanding of God and the relationship between God and themselves and other beings, and the salvation, the means by which those relationships can give rise to salvation, which is living out this loving nature, this finite loving nature which God has given us. So that's my sketch for now. Hopefully, as I say, some of that made sense, and that some more of it will make sense as people ask questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Paul Lodge, for that excellent introduction. And so now we can open it up to questions. So, any questions? Relating to this topic, of course, on science and religion. Yes?
He was giving a account that God has created human beings, everything. He is using the term creative. So I have a question that, how could God create something? Means in physics there is a theory of Big Bang, like that. Then my question is that how God could create something?
Well, I think there's nothing inconsistent between the view that Leibniz has and any scientific theory. Leibniz is simply going to say that the material world, whatever structure it has, is always something that contains this infinite number of monads. The Big Bang kind of approach says that there are certain facts about the universe that means that we will not know about certain things that happened independently of how we're related to events like the Big Bang. But it doesn't say anything about what happened before the Big Bang. It's a complicated theory that has a view about space and time, which again, we need to look at Leibniz more, but I think he's perfectly consistent with the kind of view that he's trying to put forward, because he doesn't think the material world is real. So the Big Bang wasn't, the physical description of the Big Bang is a confused description of part of the history of the universe. All that was really going on in the universe at that time was some incomprehensibly complicated set of psychological events. And he does think, remember, that, he's willing to say that even our best efforts to understand things will always be kind of infinitely inadequate, because the universe is just it's infinitely big. There's an infinite number of things, and we are essentially limited. So really, when I talk about these mathematical models, we kind of think that we're getting somewhere near understanding the way things are. We're perhaps getting somewhere near understanding what the physical world is like, but the physical world is always this massively confused way of thinking about what's really there. So we're not really getting very close to understanding that at all. In fact, the only way that we can understand what's there is through these interpersonal relationships, which arise when we treat the other person as a psychological being. So it's only when we relate to someone as another soul, through loving interaction with them, that we're actually knowing reality. Physics doesn't teach us about reality at all. I don't know whether that helps, but so Leibniz would say God created the infinite plurality of monads. Some physicists now describe that infinite plurality in a way that commits them to a scientific theory that has the Big Bang as part of it. Now, of course, in 1,000 years' time, people might think that's rubbish anyway. science evolves and the explanations evolve. I mean, the history of science is full of radical changes in the way that people have thought about the material world. It could be that new phenomena come to light and all of the theories of the 21st century seem to be massively inadequate, and inadequate in a way that doesn't mean that the theories we have in the future are successor theories, but are just completely different in structure. We have no particular reason to think that's not going to be the case.
Okay, thanks. So, next question. Yeah.
So, when you said, so whatever God is creating, the monads, so they are all unreal. So the only reality is God Himself, the Creator. Is it?
No, the monads are real. Yeah.
So God is also real, monads are real.
Yeah, I mean, he wants to resist the idea that we as individuals are ever identical with God. Now, I think there are interesting questions as to why he wants to do that. I think sometimes he writes things that make it sound as though there is this very esoteric doctrine in the background that is less committed to that. But the official doctrine is always that created individuals are distinct from each other and distinct from God. And I think there's an important reason for that. Even if he's got this deeper background view, which it's very hard to tell. I mean, in the 17th century, you may know there's also Spinoza, who Leibniz lived around the same time as, and Spinoza embraces the idea that everything is God. And Leibniz explicitly rejects that view. So he doesn't want people to think like that. Now, why doesn't he want people to think like that? Well, I suggested before that we might think that natural science is just a tool. It could be that metaphysics is just a tool as well. He never explicitly, I mean, he doesn't really say anything that makes it as obvious that that's the case as is true for physics, but I think it's consistent with lots of things that he says, and I tend in that direction myself, but that's very controversial. I think that insofar as he thinks we need to take the non-identity with God view seriously, it's partly because he thinks it's essential that our salvation involves being directed toward the world and being directed toward what might be an illusion, but nonetheless the illusion of there being other finite beings who need our attention for the sake of their salvation. It's a very tricky issue. But the official view is one where the moral life and the life of salvation involves a community of individuals working together for the individual salvation of each of the members of that community. But that salvation does not consist in disappearing into God. It consists in continuing to work in an ever better way. And that's supposed to bring you great happiness and joy. So there is a kind of psychological payoff, living joyfully in the world with the others.
For the purpose of recording, do you mind repeating the questions before you answer?
Okay, so I can.
You can do that.
Yeah, I'll do that. So okay, so next question. Yeah, you and then you.
Cool.
Thank you for your wonderful introduction.
Thank you.
Well, my question is, it's related to what he said. So if God is replicating himself into different kinds of creation, so what is the relationship between that creation and God? Like, what is the relationship the created one shares with God? As you said, that the journey is not by merging with God or going towards God, it's being what you are, like being fullest in your own form. So after you are created, you become an independent being.
Yep.
Then do you have any relationship with God, or you are just left all by yourself to develop yourself?
Okay, I'll just explain the question. So what Jonathan is asking is what the relationship is between the individual monads and God. Right? What kind of relationship do they have with each other?
Again, this is a very difficult interpretative issue about where what I say now would not be what everybody would say who is a Leibniz scholar. I think that Leibniz, certainly, I think most people would agree with this. He does not think there is a radical separation between God and creature. he doesn't want to identify the creatures with God. He does in a way that goes back to some scriptural things, though Leibniz is not taking them to be authoritative because they're scripture. He thinks they're true, and St. Paul in particular says them, namely that God is intimately present in us in some sense. So that it's very difficult to use a metaphor that's helpful, but it's sometimes referred to in Western philosophy as panentheism. So the world is not identical with God, but nor is the world radically separated from God. Somehow there's an intermingling, but it always includes the individual being aware of their individuality and God's individuality. I think then people think that's just incoherent. I have a view about what it is. I think it's an attempt, and this is really quite different from what many people think. And I think this is true within the Catholic tradition, from which really holds on to this idea. There is a notion of concurrence. This word occurs in Western theology. I think of this as a phenomenological notion, that it is supposed to try, it's an attempt in language to do justice to the feeling of being in contact with God, whilst not losing a sense of one's own individuality. So I think Leibniz is, and I think for him, certain texts suggest that this is the way that he felt, and I think that certain people within the Christian tradition had that feeling, and St. Paul seems to be somebody who fits with that description. And then at various points, there'll be people using that language for whom it really makes sense, for whom it seems to express that feeling, and then there will be other people who are willing to use that language as part of a tradition without maybe understanding it in that full sense themselves. And maybe the thought is that you keep that term alive because over time that's what's happening. People are becoming more and more aware of the presence of God, which was within them all along. So I talked about natural religion. I talked about people having an innate understanding of God. Well, one way to understand that is God is present within them. They are very faintly aware of that presence. And that's what it is to have an idea of God, to have the capacity to be aware of God. One way of thinking about the notion of an idea in general is that an idea is something that allows you to think about something else. To think about something else is to be in contact with it. So I think that the idea of concurrence, the idea of this strange connection, this kind of acquaintance, this touching of the divine nature and the human nature is part of what Leibniz is trying to express. And as I say, I want to suggest it's because that's how he feels. That's the best, and it's how various other people have felt in the past, and there might be other spiritualities. But that's the one that the tradition he's part of. And in particular at the time, he's speaking against people whose spirituality involves a radical transcendence between God and creature, but nonetheless a commitment to the existence of God, which is perhaps more like the old Jewish conception of God, and perhaps more like some Protestant conceptions of God.
Okay, thanks. Stefan, and then you, yeah.
Okay, in his view, is mathematics created by God and discovered by human beings, or is it an invention by human beings?
So who invented mathematics? Is it an invention of God or human beings? According to Leibniz.
How does it come about?
Nobody invented it. It's an expression of the divine nature. So it's built into God's nature. That's the official view. Descartes thinks God invents mathematics. Leibniz thinks that God understands mathematics, because mathematics in some sense is present in God. And we, because we are images of God, can come to understand mathematics because it's already built into our nature. We are touching God, so in a sense, everything that's in God is sort of available to us. God contains mathematics, so if we do the right kind of thing, we get to know more about mathematics. But that's the picture that he's offering us. Yeah.
So my question is, how religion can solve the problem of human unity when we are facing conflict between two religions? So how it can solve the problem of human unity?
Okay, well, the question seems to be, what would be Leibniz's take on how we can harmonize apparently conflicting religions in the context of contemporary religious strife and violence.
So again, the view is that every human being has the same understanding of God. And insofar as people disagree, it's because they are not aware of the fact that they understand God in the way that they in fact do. One needn't agree with that, but that's how you get the community, because over time, or you get a convergence on community, because over time people become more and more aware of the nature of God, and so they disagree with each other less. Now I think Leibniz's picture is one where the existence of thinking beings is going to go on forever and ever. So he isn't actually suggesting that this strife will disappear, but he does seem to suggest that there will be less of it over time. There will be progress. And he's happy with the idea that it might get better and then get worse again. But over time, it's a bit like the stock market. The way people hope the stock market will go, that it kind of keeps getting better and better. So people get more and more created things, become more and more aware of God, become more and more loving, and insofar as that happens, more and more community arises. So that, I mean, again, we might doubt that, we might disagree with him, but that's certainly the picture that we're being offered.
Okay, you and then back. Yeah, so you first.
Sir, it's a great pleasure to ask something, and it's not a question because I don't have the capacity to ask something in a question form. But I have a query because I am a student of Krishna Order. Sir, if the philosophy and science are intermingling subjects, then I think all the basic terms can be defined by both of those. So can science define the avatarism?
Okay, so his question is, can science define the concept of God incarnating as a human being, avatarism, according to Leibniz, I guess?
Well, if science is understood as knowledge, then in some sense there will be available, within knowledge as a whole, there will be an understanding of, I was talking about essentially what the avatar notion amounts to, namely this kind of concurrence, and there are beings which concur more successfully with God, and they are going to be more spiritual and more saintly. And that's what the saint is. It's the person who is more and more attuned to the divine nature that is present in them. They are not the divine nature. They remain distinct from the divine nature, but some created individuals are better at channeling the divine nature out into the world. Now, natural science, natural philosophy can't provide that kind of explanation. That kind of explanation is part of natural theology and metaphysics. But if we understand science in this bigger sense, then that's part of what science is. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Next question. You.
So, which world religious philosophy do you think comes the closest to the modern day understanding of the world?
Okay, does it relate to Leibniz? Is it?
My question was basically, is Leibniz anyhow connected to the Indian philosophical tradition?
Okay, so he's asking whether you might see connections between Leibniz's philosophy and any
Vedanta.
Okay, and Indian philosophical traditions like Vedanta or Buddhism.
I think, since everything is connected with everything else, then yes. There are so many different nuances that allow people to have different interpretations within what they're willing to regard as a particular tradition. And my ignorance of Indian philosophy and Indian religion makes this even harder. But I see kinds of resonances with certain aspects of, more Hinduism than Buddhism, because there is this official commitment to the existence of a divine being that is a person. There's an antagonism between the most straightforward readings of the central Buddhist, But again, Buddhism is so broad that you could say all kinds of things. But at the same time, what he's resisting is in this, what I'm going to say in his exoteric philosophy, so in the public version of his philosophy, he's resisting the idea that union with God, that disappearance from the spatio-temporal realm, is either desirable or possible. So we will always have a corporeal presence. Now, it's very strange because he wants to say that, you die and you become very small, and you will have a body at that point. It will be very tiny. That's why the corpse is, just is inanimate. It's not because there's no living being there. It's just become so small that we can't see it. And then we can have cremation, but that doesn't destroy the living being. And they're so small that we've no idea exactly where they go at that point. And I think Leibniz doesn't seem to think that that somebody would be would reappear so that the people that they'd already encountered in their first lifetime who continue to exist would recognize them again. I think if you're going to meet somebody again, it will only be after you've been transformed in some radical way. He really says very little about the details of this future life, which again leads me to wonder just how committed he is to taking his metaphysical views literally, and whether they're just a tool for attaining a certain kind of way of being in the world. But you could end up with a body, he seems to suggest that some bodies are, spread out in a way that occupies massive extension in space, such that we as human beings would not be aware of where these bodies are. So one thing that will happen is that you will cease to be a human being. You won't cease to be the monad that you are, and you will always have a body, but insofar as you get big again, you won't be a human anymore. So it's a strange kind of version. It's a version of reincarnation, but what's crucial is that you will always be reincarnated. There is no end to that. You never escape. And I think he would think of that as encouraging a kind of quietism, a kind of otherworldliness, a kind of retreat from the world. That's what he thinks Spinoza is encouraging. So there are elements of the Indian tradition that I think he wouldn't like, if we think of that as central.
So one way of just framing Paul's response to your question in terms of the different Vedantic traditions, we might be able to say that Leibniz would not accept the position of Advaita Vedanta, because Advaita Vedanta maintains that individuality is ultimately an illusion, or it's not real. And Leibniz is definitely committed to the reality of each individual monad, which Advaita won't accept ultimately. You can say Vyavaharika, from the Vyavaharika standpoint, they do, Advaitas do, but... Huh? Yeah, so you can say it might... Well, okay, so it's controversial. So there's so many, it's not just Vishtadvaita, there's Dvaita, there's Bheda, and there are many traditions. So, and it might be that Leibniz's views resonate with some aspects of Vishtadvaita and some aspects of even Jainism. There's an interesting connection. One of the questions that somebody asked me about Leibniz is that there seems to be a parallel between the Jaina doctrine of a gradation of souls and Leibniz's idea of different kinds of monads with different levels of intelligence or cleverness, as Paul puts it. It's a vast question, and it's one that's worth exploring, that I think people have started to explore, and it's worth exploring further. But I think he did a great job of just kind of sparking about that issue.
One thing that's interesting in that regard is it's not that Leibniz, when he talks about this reincarnation doctrine, he's not claiming empirical evidence for this. So he's not saying there are people who speak of other lives. It's part of a theory. So one of the things I think is it might be that he thinks that insofar as you have that as a theoretical commitment, if we think that theories are tools, then maybe that theoretical commitment to individuality and continued existence is really about enabling you in the here and now to be spiritually enlightened in the way that, in his sense of spiritually enlightened. That's possible. So it's certainly, obviously some views about reincarnation are like, well, we know there's reincarnation because that being is manifesting reincarnation to us. He never has anything like that.
Okay, Orpan? Yeah.
Sir, I have a question. How can Leibniz maintain the distinction between derivative forces and primitive forces? If he conceives as derivative forces are modification of primitive forces. Because we all know that once Leibniz writes a letter to J. Boulder, 20th June 1703, that derivative forces are nothing but modification and result of primitive forces.
Yeah, so you have to read the paper that I've written about this.
Okay, so I should just repeat the question. So your question is, how can Leibniz sustain the difference between derivative forces and primitive forces? Because in a letter with de Volder and a correspondence with de Volder, Leibniz seems to say that derivative forces are actually, or that primitive forces are what derived from.
Derivative forces are modifications of primitive forces.
You're right. Okay.
So this is a micro level. I mean, it's a very good question. It's a micro level question about the details of Leibniz philosophy. I have there's a paper which is online which you can read on my academia.edu page. I think my thinking has evolved a little bit since then. Essentially, I think that the derivative forces in physics are mathematized representations of the derivative forces that corporeal substances present. So the animate being is moving continually, and its apparent body is moving continually, and so there is a sense in which there's an instantaneous velocity that, there's an infinite number of instantaneous velocities that you could assign to the infinite number of points on that body. Mathematics makes some kind of choice to treat one of those as the limit case as the instantaneous trajectory, and then the derivative force is a function of the ideal size of that body and that instantaneous velocity. And in some sense that's supposed to be a representation of the continuous change that is occurring within the monad, which is being expressed through the organic change of the corporeal substance's body, and the physics deals with the abstraction from the corporeal substance, which is the mechanical representation, instantaneous mechanical representation of that body. Leibniz suggests that there really is a one-to-one correspondence between the changes in the monad, the changes in the organic body, and the changes in the mechanical representation of the organic body. I think that has to be a structural commitment that enables this to be a theory that connects the physical and the monadic worlds. I think it's very unclear to me just how satisfied he is with that, and I think it can't work. I don't think analytic geometry can be taken as any analytic geometrical representation can succeed in being legitimately regarded as a unique articulation of the change that's occurring in a monad. There are interesting issues about the analysis situ, because actually I think that what he was searching for was a geometry which wasn't analytic. So that maybe, the ideal science would have had this more pictorial quality. And if you had models which had this pictorial quality, then you wouldn't need the conservation of mv squared. That would disappear. But 17th century physics is mechanical and quantifies over size and speed, requires the illusion of a rest frame. So I think the physics didn't exist in the form he wanted. I don't know enough about contemporary physics to know whether it really still contains the possibility that he wanted, namely that natural science would model the organic, where the organic is primitive. I mean, most people don't think the organic is primitive and the inorganic is derivative. That's the central feature of his philosophy that's been lost, I think. But it's a great question. That's still lots of people trying to puzzle on that.
Any other questions? Yeah, Biplab?
Actually, I have two questions. I think that
ask one first and then
according to Leibniz, the God is perfect. God is perfect love. And if God is perfect love, then we also are perfect love. We also have these capabilities because we also are God actually. And if we think this concept is actually the truth, then how can we merge this concept with Leibniz concept of theology? Because I think Leibniz was a theologian. This is the first question.
Okay, wait, one at a time. Okay, so I'm not even sure I can ask the question. So your question seems to be if God is perfectly loving, and you seem to think that Leibniz has committed the view that individual monads also are capable of perfect love, then I'm not sure what the question is. What's the...
Then how can we merge this perfect love with his concept of theology?
How can we merge the concept of God's perfect love with theology?
His concept of theodicy.
Theodicy.
With theodicy. Okay, theodicy.
Yeah, okay. He doesn't think that creatures are capable of perfect love. So, I mean, he's committed to the principle of the identity of indiscernibles. So, if we were capable of perfect love, we would be God. So, God creates imperfect beings. In some sense, they have perfection built into them. And I think that's why they last forever. Because the temporal dimension to monadic life is in a way an expression of the fact that there's this infinity trying to get out, this infinite perfection trying to get out. And over time, more and more of it gets out. But there's always too much. And at any given moment in time, we're not able to realize the entirety of it. So we are imperfect, but the crucial thing is that we still in some sense contain the infinite and contain the perfection. It's, again, this is where it gets, to many people's mind, incoherent. And I'm just going to come back to the idea that it's an attempt to express a kind of mystical experience, for one, if we use that word, a kind of religious experience that is very strange, and yet which we find in the history of religious tradition, it seems, lots of people trying to articulate. And seems to be a robust enough way of talking that it has, at least within the Catholic tradition, and continuing with Leibniz, who's not a Catholic, been seen to be a good way of talking. But we're certainly not perfect.
Okay.
I have
okay, let's let him go first and then we can come back if we have time. Yeah.
Few points I can ask. What is my question? That religion and science both has a same goal or not? Here, what we are searching through these two tools, religion and science.
Okay, yeah, so he's asking, according to Leibniz, do religion and science have the same goal?
Yes, they do. They're both for the sake of salvation. Or for the sake of... I mean, I think actually there's a distinction between salvation and blessedness. Regeneration, salvation, and blessedness. Ideally, we become blessed, but in fact, we never get quite to blessedness. We can become saved, I think, but salvation is not the ideal state. That requires regeneration, which requires a kind of I think regeneration is the recognition that God exists and the recognition that you're a creature of God. You become saved insofar as you are committed to allowing that to work through you, and you aim toward blessedness. But that doesn't actually occur. That's just an ideal to which you're striving constantly.
Okay, a woman named Paramita Roy, she emailed me a question. She wasn't able to make it today. So I'm just going to ask one of her questions as well. And then if we have time, we'll get to yours. In Jain cosmology, we find gradation of souls according to the law of karma. Leibniz also talks of gradation of monads according to the development of their consciousness. What is the principle that lies behind the gradation of monads in Leibniz's philosophy?
So I think the principle of gradation is just that, in order to express the divine nature, there's a puzzle about why the divine nature has to express itself in creation, and there's not really, Leibniz doesn't really have an answer to that. I'm not sure, I think at that point he doesn't think that's really a legitimate question. The divine nature has expressed itself. It has expressed itself through the emergence of these creatures which are distinct from it. The view is simply that in order to express itself fully, the infinite nature just expresses itself through a densely ordered series which is produces a created infinity of beings.
I think behind her question is the idea, almost like a theodicy. Like in the Indian system, it's karma that explains why some monads are at a lower level than.
Right. So.
What would Leibniz say?
I don't think we can straightforwardly map the levels onto the state of being of the monad at a particular moment in time. So it's not like, it's just not obvious. He doesn't really say enough about that. There is certainly something analogous to the notion of karma, because he does think that punishment, so when he starts to understand these Christian, or try to explain these Christian doctrines of post-mortem punishment and hell, and he's certainly saying there's a natural justice. So what you have done, when you do bad things, you will receive punishment naturally. It's just the fruits of your labor. Now, why you happen to be a being which is less perfect than another one, well, that's just luck.
Luck, okay.
Somebody has to be number 950, somebody has to, but you can't, and then what he seems to say is, well, you've got a view according to which eventually things are going to get good for you anyway. So he doesn't want to say that you should be, this is something I'm working on at the moment, is that he's worried that the theologies that have developed in Christianity in the 17th century are all about fear, and all about trying to get people to behave themselves because bad things are going to happen. Now, Leibniz thinks we should fear God in the sense that if we do bad things will happen to us. But more importantly, we should love God, and we should love God because we should recognize that eventually the good will outweigh the bad. So there is a sense in which, yes, karma will lead to punishment in the sense of psychological pain, perhaps in the next life, but it's okay because that's all contributing to a kind of education, and eventually. Now, he doesn't commit himself explicitly to the idea that everybody gets saved, but I think that that's very close to the surface of the text, and that he is not willing to say that because that really, that might have made people not like him. It might have got him into trouble because that was a part of some theological doctrines, the idea that some people are eternally damned. Particularly certain versions of Calvinism, you are damned eternally and you will suffer eternally. Obviously many of you may be aware that goes back to the kinds of images from the Middle Ages that you'd have in Dante's Inferno or medieval paintings. Certainly that was in popular consciousness, that some people just suffered forever without any chance of salvation. Leibniz is willing to say that could be the case and still it would all be okay. God would still be perfect. But I think he's just trying to say it's not incoherent, not because he believes that people will be eternally damned. And what he's trying to do there is, I think he's trying to enable people who are parts of tradition which are committed to that to see that God is all-loving, and to be eventually pulled away from relying on the model of a fearful, eternally punishing God as their motivation for becoming better individuals. But at the same time, he wants to recognize that we can't think of ourselves as beings who are going to be saved whatever we do. There will be a kind of temporary punishment, and there is so you've still got to keep some fear there.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. I think we should end it here. You can ask your question after the discussion, because it's already 5:15. Let's all give a big round of applause to Professor Paul Lodge for
Thank you very much.
And their snacks now, shingara cha, samosas and tea. I hope.